In the spring of 1936, the famous American aviator Charles Lindbergh found himself in an unusual situation. He was standing in the opulent library of Karinhall, the massive country estate of Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Surrounding him were priceless works of art, looted treasures from across Europe, and Renaissance tapestries hanging from walls paneled in the finest oak. But Lindbergh wasn't there to admire the art. He had asked to see something far more exotic: Göring's pet lion. What happened next would become one of the most bizarre anecdotes from the inner circle of Nazi leadership. But to understand how one of history's most notorious figures came to keep African lions as household pets, we need to explore the strange intersection of ego, power, and obsession that defined Hermann Göring's life. Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born in 1893 in Bavaria, the son of a colonial governor. From his earliest years, he craved recognition and power. During World War I, he distinguished himself as a fighter ace, earning Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite, after shooting down 22 enemy aircraft. He was charismatic, daring, and hungry for glory. But Germany's defeat in 1918 left Göring adrift. Like many veterans, he felt betrayed by the terms of the Versailles Treaty. He worked briefly as a commercial pilot in Scandinavia, where he met and married a Swedish baroness, Karin von Kansow. It was Karin who would later inspire the name of his great estate, Karinhall. In 1922, Göring heard Adolf Hitler speak at a rally in Munich. He was mesmerized. Here was a man who shared his fury at Germany's humiliation, who promised to restore German greatness. Göring joined the Nazi Party immediately and quickly became one of Hitler's closest allies. He participated in the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, where he was shot in the groin, an injury that would plague him for the rest of his life and lead to his addiction to morphine. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, Göring's rise was meteoric. He accumulated titles like a collector hoarding treasures, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Prime Minister of Prussia, President of the Reichstag, Plenipotentiary of the Four-Year Plan, and Chief Huntsman of the Reich. He was Hitler's designated successor, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. But power wasn't enough for Göring. He needed to display it, to surround himself with symbols of his status, and nothing said power quite like having apex predators as pets. In 1933, the same year Hitler became chancellor, Göring began construction on what would become his greatest monument to himself, Karinhall. Located in the Schorfheide forest about 40 miles north of Berlin, the estate was named after his first wife, Karin, who had died in 1931. What started as a modest hunting lodge quickly grew into something approaching a palace. By the late 1930s, Karinhall had expanded to include a main hall that could accommodate hundreds of guests, a library containing thousands of rare books, a cinema, a gymnasium, and a swimming pool. The grounds stretched across thousands of acres and included lakes, forests, and carefully manicured gardens. Göring employed hundreds of staff to maintain the property, from gardeners to gamekeepers to art curators. The estate served multiple purposes. It was Göring's personal retreat, a place where he could escape the pressures of Berlin and indulge his passions for hunting and collecting. It was also a stage for displaying his power and wealth to visitors, both German and foreign. Every detail was calculated to impress and intimidate. The great hall featured massive wooden beams, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and walls adorned with old master paintings stolen from Jewish collectors and museums across occupied Europe. Göring was the greatest art thief of World War II, and Karinhall was his personal museum. Rembrandts, Vermeers, and Rubens competed for wall space with medieval tapestries and Renaissance sculptures. Some estimates suggest that Göring looted over 1,500 works of art during the war, with the choicest pieces displayed in his hunting lodge-turned-palace. But Karinhall wasn't just about art and architecture. Göring, who styled himself as a great huntsman in the tradition of Germanic nobility, also created something unique among Nazi leaders: his own private zoo. Hermann Göring loved animals with a passion that seemed almost contradictory for a man who was also an enthusiastic hunter. He had grown up around hunting culture, and as chief huntsman of the Reich, he controlled all hunting regulations in Germany. He frequently hosted elaborate hunting parties at Karinhall, where Nazi officials and foreign dignitaries would shoot deer, boar, and other game. Yet Göring also genuinely cared for animals. He was a vocal advocate for animal welfare laws in Nazi Germany and supported legislation that banned vivisection and restricted hunting practices. This apparent contradiction, the hunter who loved animals, was typical of Göring's complex and often hypocritical personality. At Karinhall, Göring created a menagerie that would have impressed a Renaissance prince. The private zoo included European bison, which Göring was attempting to breed back from near extinction. There were elk, deer of various species, and wild boar roaming in enclosed parklands. He kept eagles and hawks for falconry. There were exotic birds in aviaries, and at one point he even attempted to keep a young elephant, though the German climate proved unsuitable. But the crown jewels of Göring's collection were his lions. While other Nazi leaders might be content with German shepherds or hunting dogs, Göring wanted apex predators. He wanted animals that symbolized power, majesty, and danger. He wanted lions. The question was, where does one obtain lion cubs in 1930s Germany? The answer came from Dr. Lutz Heck, the director of the Berlin Zoo and one of the most influential zoologists in Germany. Heck came from a dynasty of zoo directors. His father had run the Berlin Zoo before him, and his brother ran the Munich Zoo. Lutz Heck was an ambitious man who understood that in Nazi Germany, professional advancement often depended on cultivating relationships with powerful party members. Heck was also a true believer in Nazi ideology, particularly its obsession with racial purity and the concept of returning to an imagined, pristine Germanic past. He embarked on breeding programs attempting to resurrect extinct species through selective breeding. Most famously, he tried to recreate the aurochs, the extinct wild cattle that had roamed Germanic forests. His Heck cattle were promoted as living links to Germany's ancient heritage, though modern geneticists have noted they were little more than look-alikes. When Hermann Göring expressed interest in keeping exotic animals at Karinhall, Heck saw an opportunity. He personally selected 2 lion cubs from the Berlin Zoo's breeding program and delivered them to Göring in the early 1930s. It was the beginning of a mutually beneficial relationship. Göring got his symbol of power, and Heck got a powerful patron. The arrangement was practical, at least on paper. Göring would keep the lion cubs as pets until they reached approximately 10 months of age. By that point, the young lions would be large enough to pose a serious danger to humans. They would then be returned to the Berlin Zoo for public display, where they would serve as propaganda tools, showing the German public that even the wild beasts of Africa bowed to Nazi power. In their place, Heck would provide fresh cubs, ensuring that Göring always had young, manageable lions to display to visitors. To accommodate his new pets, Göring had special facilities constructed both at Karinhall and at his other residence on the Obersalzberg near Hitler's Berghof retreat in the Bavarian Alps. These weren't simple cages, but substantial enclosures, designed and built by experts. Professional keepers were employed to care for the animals, ensuring they were fed, healthy, and properly contained. But Göring had no intention of keeping his lions locked away. Hermann Göring's lions were not merely exotic pets kept at a safe distance. They were integral parts of his carefully constructed image as a larger-than-life figure who bent even nature to his will. When the lions were young and manageable, Göring would allow them the run of Karinhall's opulent rooms, shocking and delighting visitors in equal measure. Contemporary accounts describe surreal scenes of Göring at breakfast, dressed in one of his elaborate custom-made uniforms. He had hundreds, while a lion cub wandered freely around the dining room. Göring would hand-feed the animals directly from the table, offering them choice cuts of meat while his guests watched in fascination or barely concealed terror. Visitors to Karinhall were routinely encouraged to interact with the lions. For some, it was a thrilling experience. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator and Hitler's primary Axis ally, visited Karinhall in 1937 and was absolutely enthralled by Göring's lions. Photographs from the visit show Il Duce observing the animals with evident delight, perhaps seeing in them a reflection of his own imperial ambitions. After all, Italy had recently conquered Ethiopia, and the Lion of Judah had been one of that nation's symbols. But not everyone was so enthusiastic. The professional keepers employed to care for the lions were frequently concerned by Göring's casual attitude toward safety. Most alarming was Emmy Göring, Hermann's second wife, whom he had married in 1935 after Karin's death. Emmy, a former actress, shared her husband's love of the dramatic, and she would often enter the lion enclosures alone to play with the animals. The keepers watched nervously, knowing that even young lions possess powerful jaws and sharp claws. One swipe delivered in play could cause serious injury. Emmy herself seemed to relish the danger, or perhaps she simply trusted the animals completely. She was photographed numerous times with the lions, sometimes in remarkably casual settings, sitting on a sofa while a lion cub lounged beside her, or walking the grounds with a young lion following at her heels like an oversized house cat. The most famous incident involving Göring's lions occurred during Charles Lindbergh's visit in 1936. Charles Lindbergh was an international celebrity in the 1930s, famous for his solo transatlantic flight in 1927. By 1936, he had become interested in European aviation developments, particularly Germany's rapidly expanding Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring, ever the showman and eager to impress foreign dignitaries with German technological prowess, invited Lindbergh to visit Germany and tour aircraft factories. Lindbergh accepted, and during his visit he was invited to Karinhall for lunch. The American aviator had heard rumors about Göring's unusual pets and specifically requested to see the Reichsmarshal's lion. Göring was delighted to oblige. After lunch, the party retired to Karinhall's magnificent library, a room lined floor to ceiling with rare books and manuscripts, many of them stolen. A keeper brought in one of Göring's favorite lions, a young male named Augie. The lion, excited by the presence of so many people, immediately bounded toward Göring with the enthusiasm of a much smaller pet. Before Göring could react, the several hundred-pound cub leaped up, placing its massive paws on Göring's shoulders, and began enthusiastically licking his face. What happened next turned the display of power into a moment of humiliation. The overexcited lion, overwhelmed by the crowd and the activity, did what frightened or excited animals sometimes do. It urinated, copiously, all over Hermann Göring's pristine white uniform. The library fell silent. Göring's face turned crimson. His eyes blazed with fury as he shoved the lion away and stood, dripping, in front of his distinguished guests. The Reichsmarschall, the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, the man who commanded the Luftwaffe, the man who had carefully cultivated an image of absolute control, had just been humiliated by his own pet. Emmy Göring quickly moved to diffuse the situation, speaking soothingly to her husband. Göring, regaining his composure, offered a strained explanation to the gathered guests. There were too many people, he said. The young lion had been frightened by the crowd. These things happen with animals. But everyone in the room could see the fury in his eyes as he stalked off to change his uniform. Lindbergh, ever the diplomat, made no public comment about the incident, but it was too good a story not to spread. Within weeks, diplomatic circles across Europe were chuckling about Göring and his lion. It was a rare moment when the carefully constructed facade of Nazi invincibility cracked to reveal something almost comically human underneath. The incident may have contributed to a gradual change in Göring's household arrangements. By the late 1930s, circumstances were changing at Karinhall. In June 1938, Emmy Göring gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Etta, after the wife of Benito Mussolini. The arrival of a baby changed the dynamics of the household considerably. While Göring might have been willing to risk his own safety and that of his guests by keeping young lions in the house, even he recognized that an infant required more caution. According to most accounts, Göring ceased allowing lions to roam freely through Karinhall's rooms around the time of Etta's birth. The animals were increasingly confined to their purpose-built enclosures, though Göring continued to keep lions on the property and visit them regularly. The private zoo at Karinhall remained operational throughout the war years, even as Germany's military fortunes declined. The arrangement with Dr. Lutz Heck and the Berlin Zoo continued as well. Young lions were periodically returned to the zoo once they reached a dangerous size, and fresh cubs would be delivered to replace them. This system persisted until the chaos of the war's final years made such niceties impossible. The Berlin Zoo itself would suffer tremendously during the war. Beginning in 1943, Allied bombing raids increasingly targeted Berlin, and while the zoo was not specifically targeted, it suffered damage from bombs meant for nearby railway stations and industrial facilities. By 1945, as the Red Army fought its way into Berlin street by street, the zoo became a battlefield. Many animals were killed in the fighting or had to be destroyed by their keepers to prevent them from escaping into the ruined city. Dr. Heck had managed to evacuate some of the zoo's most valuable animals to other locations before the final battle for Berlin. His Heck cattle, his pride and joy, were moved to rural areas where they survived the war. Some accounts suggest that several of Göring's former lions were among the animals evacuated, though records from this chaotic period are incomplete. As for Karinhall itself, its fate was sealed by the same Allied advance that doomed the Berlin Zoo. By early 1945, Hermann Göring's world was collapsing. The Luftwaffe, which he had built and commanded, had failed to prevent Allied bombers from devastating German cities. His influence with Hitler had waned as military failures mounted. The man who had once been the Führer's designated successor was increasingly sidelined and blamed for Germany's deteriorating situation. As the Soviet Red Army advanced westward across Poland and into eastern Germany, it became clear that Karinhall lay directly in their path. In April 1945, with Soviet forces just miles away, Göring made the decision to destroy his beloved estate rather than let it fall into enemy hands. He ordered his staff to remove as much as possible: art, valuables, personal effects. Convoys of trucks carried away some of the looted treasures, though there was no time to evacuate everything. What remained was Karinhall itself, the massive lodge that had been the physical manifestation of Göring's power and ego. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th and final birthday, Göring ordered Karinhall destroyed. Luftwaffe engineers placed demolition charges throughout the structure. The explosions that followed reduced the once magnificent estate to rubble. The great hall where Göring had entertained foreign dignitaries, the library where a lion had once humiliated him, the rooms where Emmy had walked with lions at her heels, all were reduced to smoking ruins. What became of Göring's lions in these final chaotic days is not entirely clear. Most likely, the older animals had already been returned to the Berlin Zoo or other facilities as per the usual arrangement. Any remaining animals on the property would have been evacuated with other livestock, or more grimly, destroyed before the demolition. No records exist of lions running loose through the Schorfheide forest after Karinhall's destruction. Göring himself fled south to Bavaria, where he attempted to negotiate with the Western Allies. He was captured by American forces in May 1945. The man who had kept lions as pets and surrounded himself with looted art and symbols of power spent his final year in a cell at Nuremberg. The irony was not lost on observers. The man who had created a private zoo now found himself caged, on display for the world to judge. During the Nuremberg trials, Göring was charged with conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He had helped plan Germany's aggressive wars, he had overseen the looting of occupied territories, and his signature appeared on documents implementing the Holocaust. Yet Göring remained defiant throughout the trial. Unlike many of his co-defendants who claimed ignorance or blamed Hitler, Göring largely acknowledged his role but remained unapologetic. He saw himself not as a criminal but as a loyal German officer who had served his country. His testimony was sharp, his memory detailed, and he often sparred effectively with prosecutors. In his own twisted view, he had done his duty. The tribunal found him guilty on all counts and sentenced him to death by hanging. But Hermann Göring would deny the Allies even this final victory. On October 15, 1946, the night before his scheduled execution, Göring swallowed a cyanide capsule that he had somehow managed to conceal throughout his imprisonment. He died in his cell, avoiding the hangman's noose. How he obtained the poison remains a mystery. Some believe a sympathetic guard provided it, others think he had concealed it on his person since his capture and somehow avoided detection through multiple searches. We will likely never know for certain. What we do know is that the man who had once hand-fed lions at his breakfast table died alone in a concrete cell, his empire reduced to dust, his name synonymous with evil. The story of Hermann Göring's pet lions is more than just a bizarre historical footnote. It reveals something essential about the nature of power, ego, and the Third Reich itself. Göring's lions were never really about the animals themselves. They were symbols, props in an elaborate performance designed to project power and inspire awe. Every aspect of Göring's life was calculated for effect, from his elaborate uniforms to his stolen art collection to his exotic pets. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of Nazi Germany's obsession with spectacle and domination. The lions represented the ultimate expression of control. Here was a man so powerful that even the king of beasts served at his table. It was Roman in its excess and its symbolism. Emperors had once staged spectacles in the Colosseum featuring lions. Göring brought them into his home. But the Lindbergh incident revealed the essential absurdity of it all. No matter how much power Göring accumulated, no matter how many titles he held, or how elaborate his displays, he could not truly control nature. The lion remained a wild animal, and wild animals do not respect uniforms or titles. In that moment of humiliation in the library, as Göring stood soaked in lion urine before his guests, the carefully constructed facade cracked. Dr. Lutz Heck, the man who provided Göring with his lions, survived the war and continued to run the Berlin Zoo until 1945, when he was removed by Allied authorities. He faced investigation for his cooperation with the Nazi regime, but was never prosecuted. He died in 1983, still defending his breeding programs and his attempt to resurrect extinct species. His Heck cattle still exist today, kept in nature preserves across Europe, a living legacy of Nazi Germany's bizarre obsession with racial purity extended to the animal kingdom. The Berlin Zoo itself was rebuilt after the war and remains one of the world's premier zoological institutions. Its dark history during the Nazi era is now acknowledged and documented. The zoo that once bred lions for a Reichsmarshal's pleasure now serves conservation and education. As for Karinhall, little remains. Soviet forces stripped the site of anything valuable after the war, and the rubble was gradually cleared away or reclaimed by nature. Today, only fragments of foundation and scattered stones mark where Göring's palace once stood. The Schorfheide forest has reclaimed the land, and nature has erased the physical traces of Göring's excess. But the story of his lions remains, a window into a world where power was absolute, where symbols mattered more than substance, and where even apex predators could be reduced to props in a madman's performance. Hermann Göring's pet lions represent one of the stranger footnotes in World War II history, but they're emblematic of the Nazi regime's combination of grandiosity, cruelty, and absurdity. While Göring surrounded himself with symbols of power, stolen art, elaborate uniforms, exotic animals, his empire was built on murder, theft, and oppression. The lions were just another piece of the performance, another way to intimidate and impress. In the end, both the Reichsmarschall and his lions became relics of a failed regime. Göring died by his own hand, avoiding the justice he deserved. His lions lived out their lives in zoos or died in the chaos of war. Karinhall was reduced to rubble, and the Berlin Zoo was rebuilt by people dedicated to actual conservation rather than propaganda. The next time you visit a zoo and see lions, remember that these magnificent animals deserve better than to be props in powerful men's fantasies. They are apex predators, survivors of millions of years of evolution, and they belong in the wild or in ethical conservation programs, not pacing in the halls of stolen palaces, waiting to perform for tyrants. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.